What if I told you that inside old churches, the ones that smell of candle wax and dust, some prayers were never meant for God, that behind their holy doors, people didn't just confess their sins, they created them. Tonight, I'll take you inside 3 real churches where screams replaced sermons, and mercy turned into murder. Once you enter, there's no way out because in these walls, faith demands a sacrifice. It was a stormy night. Rain dripped through the cracked roof of an old countryside church standing beside an abandoned graveyard. The church had been closed for years after strange events that no one dared to speak of. Tonight, it stood silent again, until a young filmmaker named Ollie arrived. He was shooting a documentary about haunted religious sites, and this church was his final stop. As he stepped inside, the heavy wooden doors creaked like the groan of a dying man. The air smelled of candle wax, decay, and wet stone. The pews were lined with dust, yet the altar candles were faintly burning. Ollie set up his camera, muttering into his mic. Locals say every night at 2, a voice calls for mercy here. He looked around nervously, the flickering light stretching shadows across the walls. A low gust of wind swept through the church, and the door slammed shut behind him. He froze. Ollie turned slowly, breathing hard, flashlight trembling in his hand. "Hello," he called, his voice echoing into the hollow nave. There was no reply, only the sound of dripping water from the ceiling. He pressed record and walked toward the altar, his shoes crunching broken glass underfoot. On the pulpit, he found an old Bible covered in dust and a torn photograph of a priest whose eyes had been scratched out. The caption read, "Father Raymond, died 1987. Suddenly, the cross above the altar swayed on its chain, creaking louder and louder until it fell, crashing to the floor inches from Ollie's feet. The camera caught everything. He backed away, whispering, "What the hell?" before tripping over something buried beneath a rug. When he pulled it aside, he found a small trapdoor made of rotten wood, sealed with a rusty lock that had already been broken. He opened it. The air that rose from below was cold and foul, like death itself. His flashlight flickered as he climbed down the narrow stone steps into the basement. The deeper he went, the more suffocating the air became. On the walls were symbols painted in red, circles, eyes, and Latin words he couldn't understand. In the center of the basement stood a stone altar, blackened by age, and around it lay dozens of melted candles and bones, human bones. He stepped closer, filming, and saw something carved into the stone. "He shall rise again through those who trespass." Suddenly he heard breathing, faint, slow, and just behind him. He swung the flashlight around, but no one was there. Yet the breathing continued, louder now, circling him. He shouted, "Who's there?" And the flashlight went out. In total darkness, he could hear whispering, dozens of voices chanting in Latin, growing faster and faster. Then silence. A single female voice whispered close to his ear, "You shouldn't have come." The flashlight flicked back on for a second, and he saw a pale figure in priest's robes, eyes hollow, face bloodless. The figure's mouth opened unnaturally wide as if screaming, but no sound came. The light died again and Ollie ran, tripping on the stairs, scrambling up toward the surface. When he reached the door, it wouldn't open. He pulled and screamed, but it stayed shut. Behind him, the footsteps came, slow, deliberate, echoing off the marble floor. The last thing his camera recorded was a whisper, "Join our silent mass." His camera was found outside the church door the next morning, soaked in rain. Ollie was never seen again. Inside the church, the candles on the altar were lit once more, though no one had entered. Father Imran, an old priest, had served St. Mercy Church for 35 years. The church was ancient, its walls scarred by centuries of storms, its confession booth older than any living soul. He was known for his kindness, yet a deep sadness lived in his eyes. Years ago, another priest named Father Yusuf had vanished after a strange confession night. Since then, people claimed to hear murmurs inside the empty booth at midnight. Whispers of sins never forgiven. Father Imran refused to believe such talk until one cold evening when the church bell rang at exactly 11 p.m. Though he hadn't pulled the rope. He entered the confession booth, its small space filled with the smell of old wood and candle wax. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned," came a trembling young woman's voice. Her name was Sarah. She said she had done something terrible, but every time she tried to speak, her voice cracked. It wasn't my fault. It made me do it, she whispered. Father Imran leaned closer. What made you do it, my child? There was silence, then faint static, like a radio tuning. Father Yusuf, she said softly. Imran froze. What did you say? He asked. But she didn't answer. Only breathing. Then the lights in the church flickered. When he opened the small window of the confessional, Sarah was gone. Only her rosary remained on the seat. Disturbed, he left the booth, but the church door slammed shut. The air turned colder. From inside the confessional, he heard whispering. His own name repeated again and again. He turned back slowly, hand trembling, and opened the booth. It was empty, yet the seat was warm, and the smell of incense filled the air. Then came a voice soft and broken. You left me, Imran. It was Father Yusuf's voice, one he hadn't heard in 20 years. The shadows behind the booth shifted, forming a faint human shape. You promised me salvation, the voice said. Imran stumbled backward, clutching his cross. You're dead. The whisper replied, dead but not forgiven. The candles in the church flared, the cross on the wall fell, and from the confessional's slit, a pale hand reached out, grasping the air. Father Imran screamed and ran to the altar, shouting prayers, but the church echoed his words back to him in another tone, mocking him. Then all went quiet. The next morning, the caretaker found the church doors open. The booth door was swinging gently, and 2 sets of footprints led into it, but only one came out. Father Imran's diary was discovered beside the altar. The last line read, He spoke again tonight. The booth will not stay silent. Locals say if you enter that church alone after midnight, you can still hear 2 priests whispering, one seeking forgiveness, the other refusing to give it. In a remote village surrounded by mist and wood stood St. Rosa's Church, a small stone building that once thrived with Sunday Mass. But beneath its holy reputation lay a ritual long forgotten, a ritual of sacrifice. Years ago, the villagers had offered human blood to the voice of mercy that lived beneath the altar. When the priest of that time sealed the chamber, the church was abandoned for decades. That was until Pastor Rashid arrived, determined to reopen and cleanse the place. The villagers warned him not to disturb what was buried, but he ignored them. He said, Fear is the devil's greatest lie. On his first night inside, he heard something move under the floorboards, slow dragging, like nails across stone. A few days later, a volunteer named Bilal joined him to clean the basement. They found a locked iron door hidden behind the altar, marked with a symbol, a bleeding chalice surrounded by 7 eyes. What's this? Bilal asked. Pastor Rashid hesitated. The chamber of offering. The last priest sealed it. We'll open it and bless it with prayer. Against his better judgment, Bilal helped him break the lock. The hinges screamed as the door opened. Inside was a circular room covered in carvings, and in its center stood an altar stained with dark, dried blood. Candles still sat in their holders as though waiting to be lit. As Bilal filmed the discovery for documentation, the air grew thick. He whispered, Do you hear that? From somewhere in the darkness came a low hum, like 1,000 voices chanting at once. Suddenly, all the candles burst into flame by themselves. Shadows danced wildly along the walls. Bilal dropped his camera, backing away. Pastor Rashid began reciting verses, his voice trembling, but the flames rose higher, forming a human-like figure on the altar, a figure with no face, just a gaping mouth that screamed without sound. The church shook violently, dust falling from the ceiling. Close it, Rashid shouted. Seal the door. But before they could, the figure lunged forward and the flames went out, leaving only the echo of its silent cry. They fled the basement, but when they reached the main hall, the church door had vanished. In its place stood the stone altar from below, now glowing faintly red. Bilal collapsed, crying, while Rashid tried to pray. Then a voice filled the air, deep, echoing, and ancient. The offering is incomplete. Bilal looked up, terrified, as blood began to drip from the ceiling. The pews cracked, the statues of saints turned their faces toward him. Rashid screamed in horror as the shadow figure rose behind Bilal, its long fingers stretching toward his neck. The camera, still recording, captured the moment before it all went black. When villagers entered the church the next morning, They found no trace of Bilal or Rashid. Only the altar remained, spotless, except for a fresh chalice placed neatly at its center, filled with blood. That night, the church bells rang by themselves. Since then, no one dares to enter St. Raza's. But travelers say that when the wind passes through its ruins, you can hear prayers whispered backward. And if you listen too long, you start whispering back. The young man stared at the open trapdoor, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The air beneath it felt alive, breathing, whispering his name again. And again, against his instincts, he leaned closer, the beam catching a reflection below, not metal, not water, but eyes, dozens of eyes staring back from the dark. Suddenly the church bells rang, 3 deep thunderous tolls, though no one had touched them for decades. The wooden floor creaked and cold fingers wrapped around his wrist, pulling him toward the hole. He screamed, dropping the camera. The last thing it recorded was the trapdoor slamming shut. Hours later, the villagers found the church silent again. The candles still burned, the air was thick with dust, but on the altar where no one had placed it lay his camera, its red light blinking, still recording. And in the faint echo of the bells, a whisper filled the empty church, saying, "Welcome home."